Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read a lightly edited version of Cave Regions of the Ozarks and Black Hills by Luella Agnes Owen, published in 1898. The book will be read in order, so if you would like to begin at the beginning, please start with Season 3, Episode 44. Content note: if by some chance you feel inspired to investigate any locations mentioned, please keep in mind that they may not be currently accessible to the public. Some are operated as commercial caves and have been noted as such where appropriate. This book was written quite some time ago and therefore does not necessarily reflect current-day outlooks and language choices. The scientific texts may use outdated terminology or be inaccurate in light of more recent discoveries. This podcast was created primarily to help you relax and to entertain you. The texts are chosen for their ability to charm and interest you, rather than for educational purposes. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Exploration Dreamland. If you have a moment to leave us a review on iTunes, it would help other listeners find us. You can also hear our episodes on YouTube. If you are listening there, please like our episodes and leave a comment for us. We'd love to hear from you. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. Chapter 6, Oregon County Caves. Greer Spring. Oregon County is also at the extreme southern limit of the state of Missouri and was visited not because its caves are supposed to be either finer or more numerous than those of all the other Ozark counties, but on account of remarkable attractions associated with them that are not known to be equaled, or even subject to rivalry, by any similar works of nature in any portion of the world. The most convenient railway point is Thayer. The station hotel affords comfortable accommodations for headquarters, and the last days of September proved a charming time. The foliage was in full summer glory, refreshed by a gentle and copious rain, and the insinuating tick had already retired from active business until the following season. The carriage having been ordered on condition of its being a clear day, we left Thayer at 8 o'clock on a perfect morning to visit Greer Spring, and were soon in the depth of the beautiful Ozark forest, from which we did not once emerge until Alton, the county seat, was reached, the distance traveled being 16 miles. Here we stopped for dinner at the small hotel kept by one of the old-time early settlers who came to the region before the war. The dinner was a surprise, and received the highest commendation possible to a dinner, the hearty appreciation of a boy. A young nephew, Arthur J. Owen, having been invited to act as escort on the trip, found all the varied experience in cave hunting fully equal to the pictured joys of anticipation. After a large bell suspended somewhere outside had notified the business public that dinner was ready to be served, we were invited to the dining room, where on a long table was the abundance of vegetables afforded by the season and soil of an almost tropical state, and cooked as the white-capped chef of the great hotel, where the warm weeks were spent, had not learned the secret of, and the delicately fried chicken was not of that curious variety commonly encountered by travelers, in which the development of legs robs the centipede of his only claim to distinction. As the dishes cooled, they were removed and fresh supplies brought in. Our driver received directions about the road, and we started on another drive of 7 miles. These directions were to follow the main road to the Forks, and then keep to the Van Buren Road, and anyone could tell us where Captain Greer lives. The road was, as before, through the park-like forest, and, as before, lay chiefly along the ridge, so that where clearings had been made for farms, there were fine views over the distant country, which everywhere was forest-covered hills of a rich green near at hand, but changing with the growth of distance, first to dark and then to lighter blue. In these forests were fine young cattle and horses, and uncounted numbers of razorbacks, or as they are otherwise called, wind-splitters. For the benefit of those who may not be familiar with the names, it might be well to explain that they are the natural heirs of the native wild hog of Missouri and Arkansas. These animals are such swift runners, it is said they can safely cross the railroad between trucks of the fast express. Their snouts are so long and thin, it is also claimed that 2 can drink from a jug at the same time. Never having seen it done, however, this is not vouched for, but merely repeated as hearsay. After a time, we stopped to inquire the way of an old man dipping water from a pond by the roadside. He told us he was dipping water to wash the wheat he was sowing in the field just over the fence, and that we reached the Forks, then to keep the Van Buren Road, pass 2 houses on the left, a white one on the right, another on the left, and then inquire the way. Anyone could tell us, and Captain Greer would show us to the spring, quote, "for he is a mighty accommodating man." End quote. On we went to the Forks, where in the point of the Y stood a large tree with a Van Buren signboard on one side, and in the direction it pointed, we turned, although rather reluctantly, for it looked little used and rocky, while the other was in good condition. But we followed the signboard and had no misgivings until it began to be realized that a great deal of time was being passed, but no houses. The morning had been very chilly, but now the atmosphere was just at that balmy point between warm and cool that makes mere living an unqualified luxury. And added to this, we soon found ourselves in a deep canyon, no less beautiful than the justly celebrated North Cheyenne Canyon near Colorado Springs. There was now no doubt that we were on the wrong road, but such magnificence was unexpected and not to be turned from with indifference. For some distance the road makes a gradual and rather perilous-looking descent along the steep and broken slope on the shady side of the ancient river's great retaining wall, while that opposite is glorified by the brilliant glow of the afternoon sun, which adds an equal charm to the rich, luxuriant foliage below and the tall, stately pines that adorn, without concealing, the gray rock they proudly cling to, or that rises in a protecting rampart 300 feet higher than the canyon bed, with banners of the long-needled pine waving above to proclaim the perfection of nature's undisturbed freedom. The road descending crosses the thread of water still flowing among the great rounded boulders left by the former torrent, and our view is changed to one of dense but by no means melancholy shadows with a crown of golden sunlight, and presently the course of the canyon turns to the east, and it is all filled with the yellow rays, and we notice the bright red hawthorn berries and masses of hydrangea still showing remnants of their late profusion of bloom. We Missourians have a great love of fine scenery, and generally take long journeys into other states in order to gratify the taste, while quite unconscious of the wonderful beauty and grandeur of the Ozarks. Where the canyon begins to broaden into a small sheltered valley as it approaches 11 Points River, we turned and retraced our way to the forks, and a short distance beyond to a house where we might again inquire. A woman came to the open door as we stopped, and in answer to the question said, quote, "You ought to have asked me when you passed here a while ago." End quote. Apologies for the seeming neglect were offered and accepted. Then she explained that both roads went to Van Buren, but not to Greer Spring, where in due time we at length arrived. The house being in one corner of a 40, and the spring in that diagonally opposite, there was a walk of nearly that distance before coming to an old road inclining steeply down into what looked to be a narrow canyon. About midway of this sloping road, the space confined between perpendicular walls, rising to heights above on one side and descending to the stream on the other, widens suddenly, and a picturesque old mill comes into view, it having been wholly screened from the approach by the rich growth of shrubs and trees. Chief in abundance among this luxury of leaf was the hydrangea, a favorite shrub largely imported into this country from Japan before it was discovered as a native. The mill site seems to have been selected for its beauty, although we were told that at this point the stream is 72 feet wide and 2½ feet deep, but could be raised 30 feet with perfect safety by a dam, for which the rock is already on the ground, and much of it broken ready for use. The flow is said to be 280 yards per minute, with no appreciable variation, and never freezes. The high walls of the Greer Spring Gorge will, of course, far more than double the value it would otherwise possess when it becomes desirable to control and turn to practical account the power now going so cheerily to waste, but the artistic loss will be proportionately severe. The old mill was the scene of great activity in former times, but was closed on account of an unfortunate accident, and for years has had no other duty than simply to serve as a portion of the landscape. Just beyond, the canyon makes a curving bend, the road dwindles to a narrow path, and we behold the most beautiful scene imaginable. The canyon has come to an end, and is shut in by a graceful curve of the high perpendicular gray walls that are crowned with trees and shrubs, and decked below with a thick carpet of bright green moss. In this basin, which is nearly 100 feet across, Greer Spring plunges up from beneath through an opening 9 feet in diameter, in the midst of a pool of water 6 feet deep, and having an unvarying temperature of 49 degrees throughout the year. This water is so perfectly clear that not the least pebble is obscured from view, and the color scheme is most marvelous. Where the great spring forces its way to the surface, the water is a deep, brilliant blue with white caps, and its falling weight keeps clear of moss a large spot of fine, pure white sandstone, while all the balance appears a vivid green from the moss that thrives beneath the moving water. And surrounding these are the handsome foliage-decked gray walls. The edges of the basin are thickly strewn with fallen rocks, deeply covered with moss, in which small ferns are growing, and on these stepping stones we crossed to the head wall of the canyon to find ourselves at the open mouth of a cave from which flows a clear, shallow stream to join the waters of the spring in that wonderful basin. The entrance to the cave is an arch about 15 feet wide and 12 feet high, with the clear, shallow stream spreading over the clean rock floor from side to side. Here now was presented a difficulty. Truly, the cave was not quite dry. The water was about 10 inches deep, and my boots in Thayer. Contrary to advice, however, my nephew had brought his, and with a boy's kindness loaned them while he made the trip with bare feet and rolled-up trousers. A short distance within, the cave widens, and the floor of the extension, being somewhat higher, is dry, but the roof drops so low over it that the watercourse is an easier route of travel, and this soon widens into a lake above which the ceiling rises in a broad dome less than 20 feet in height, and hung with heavy masses of dripstone draperies of varying length, from 5 to 7 feet, and all the ceilings are fringed at various heights with stalactites of every size and age, some being a clear colorless onyx, while others proclaim their great age in the fact that they have so deteriorated that the onyx texture is either partly or completely lost, and what was once a pure drip crystal has returned to a common, porous, dull-colored limestone so soft that portions can be rubbed to powder in the hand. Picking the way carefully as the depth of the lovely lake increased, we followed the sound of falling water and peered into the dark distance in a vain effort to see it, yet expecting to reach that special object of interest by keeping to the shallower parts of the lake. These expectations were shattered suddenly when the boots filled with water, and that called to mind the fact that 23 miles and a chilly night lay between us and dry clothing. So we returned to the outside world and rested on the rocks where Captain Greer and our young driver waited for us. The cave has never been fully explored, and probably we penetrated farther than others have ever done, as the owner knew nothing of the falling water we so distinctly heard, and were surely very near. The view from the rocks is wonderfully beautiful and includes both the entrance to the cave, with its flowing stream, and the receiving basin with its bounding stream. But it was growing late in the afternoon, and there was another cave whose entrance was in the perpendicular wall above the end of the path by which we had come. This entrance could be reached by a dilapidated ladder, assisted by a forked pole and supplied with candles and matches, my nephew and I achieved the ascent with not much trouble. Here we found what is, no doubt, one of the oldest caves known. The original cavity is nearly filled up with masses of onyx, colorless crystal, and white striped with pale shades of gray. The cave is perfectly dry, and freshly broken surfaces in some places show signs of deterioration, so how can we venture even a guess as to the time it has required to first excavate the cave and then fill it with masses of rock deposited by the slow drip process, and later for that crystalline rock in a now dry atmosphere to present a perceptible weakening? We went as far as passages could be crawled into, which was no great distance, and at once started on our uncertain descent of the ladder. But this was not a matter of so much concern as the upward trip, for the success of which some doubts were entertained, for going down is always naturally a less certain matter, as one can fall if more desirable means are unsuccessful, and I have unexpectedly reached many coveted points in this simple manner. Taking a last look at Greer Spring with its cave river, gray walls, gay with foliage, and all the harmony of color and form combined in a narrow canyon that was once the main body of a great cave, I recalled views on the Hudson River and in the mountains of Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, and others out in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and the Wasatch in Utah. But amid all their wonderful grandeur and famous beauty, could remember no spot superior to this masterpiece of the Ozarks. The proprietor of the spring and 1,000 acres of land adjacent took personal possession on the day of Lincoln's first election to establish a home. The sun, having failed to consider our wishes, was now about to disappear in a gleaming flood of gold, so the return to Thayer that night was out of the question. Our host and his wife observed that fact and cordially invited us to remain for the night, and as much longer as we would like to. But being unwilling to impose on kindness to such an extent, we returned to the hotel in Alton, and now urgently advise that those who ever have an opportunity to enjoy a moonlight drive through the Ozark forests should not let it pass unimproved. Other caves nearby. About 12 miles from Alton, there are 3 other caves worthy of attention. 2 of these are known only as the Saltpeter Caves, and the third as the Bat Cave. Not many persons care to visit the Bat Cave, for although its inhabitants are small, they have evidently decided to take no risks through hospitality. Their warnings can be heard like distant thunder for some distance outside the cave, and any unheeding intruder is set upon in fury by such vast numbers of the little creatures that his only safety is in hasty retreat. During the war, the 2 saltpeter caves were worked to a considerable extent, and also served as safe retreats for the residents of the region, as well as the visiting Johnny when the vicinity became oppressively blue. Both of these caves are especially notable on account of the fine stalactites with which they are abundantly supplied, most of them being snow white and from 14 to 20 feet in length. Unfortunately, most of the caves in this region have been deprived of great quantities of their beautiful adornments by visitors who are allowed to choose the best and remove it in such quantities as may suit their convenience and pleasure. Those who own the caves, and those who visit them, would do well to remember that if all the natural adornment should be allowed to remain in its original position, it would continue to afford pleasure to many persons for an indefinite time. But if broken, removed, and scattered, the pleasure to a few will be comparatively little, and that short-lived. The gift of beauty should always be honored and protected for the public good. We were not so fortunate as to discover fossils of any kind in this locality, although the search was by no means thorough. But even if it had been, the result might have been the same, since that county and others adjoining have been mapped as Cambrian. The greater part of the exposed rock is a fine sandstone, almost as white as gypsum on a fresh fracture, and much of it is ripple-marked so as to show a beautifully fluted surface of remarkable regularity. These ripple flutings are sometimes more than an inch in width, and often less, but the variations never appear on the same level, the smallest being seen on the hilltops and the larger outcropping on the downward slopes. Chapter 7. The Grand Gulf. A quick note from your host in 2023. This area is now part of Grand Gulf State Park. Oregon County, Missouri is also fortunate in having within its limits the Grand Gulf, which has been declared by competent judges to be one of the wonders of the world, and it offers a combination of attractions that certainly entitles it to an important place among a limited few of America's choicest scenes. The Gulf is nearly 9 miles northwest of Thayer, Missouri, and about equally distant from Mammoth Spring in Arkansas, just a little south of the Missouri state line. The drive is a pleasant one, as the road winds among the forest-clad hills and passes occasional fields of cotton and corn. But having been macadamized in very ancient times by the original and all-powerful general government of that early period, is somewhat rough, yet threatens no danger greater than the destruction of wheels. The only approach to the Gulf is over the hilltops, and the entrance in past times while it was still a cave must have been a sinkhole in the roof of the largest chamber. This chamber is now the upper end of the Grand Gulf, and into it we descend by a rugged path, sufficiently difficult to maintain expectations of grandeur that are not doomed to disappointment. The precipitous walls, 200 feet in height, bear a faithful record of the energy of circling floods, but instead of frowning, as some good people persistently accuse all noble heights of doing, they seem to look with conscious pride towards the windings of the great rough chasm, where every available spot has been seized on as a homestead for some form of vegetation. All the great dark rock masses that interfere with easy progress along the lowest depth were surrounded by a feathery setting of blooming white ageratum, and each turn in the winding course reveals new charms of rock and verdure with their varying lights and shadows, until the crowning glory is reached at the natural bridge, about 1,200 feet from the upper end of the canyon. This bridge is magnificent. It was impossible to secure photographs because it gave no point of view for a small camera, and it was equally impossible to reach desirable points for taking measurements. But the open arch is not less than 20 feet wide and considerably more than that in height. From the floor or bed of the gulf to the road that crosses the bridge is more than 200 feet. The passage under the bridge makes a curve, the shortest side of which measures exactly 219 feet. And as the width varies from 20 to 40 feet, the other side is longer. Most of the floor is flat and level, as also is the ceiling, the greatest irregularities being along the wall of greater length, which shows at what points the rushing water has spent its force. No water flows through here now, except in times of heavy rainfall. The other end of the bridge has a somewhat smaller span, but is very handsome, and the outward views from both are exceedingly fine. After traversing about 400 feet more of the beautiful high-walled gulf, we stood before the grand entrance to the cave, which is strikingly similar to the first arch of the bridge. The only picture I was able to get was taken from the slope of the bridge crown, 100 feet below the road, and merely gives a suggestion of the magnificence waiting peacefully for the crowds of eager and enthusiastic sightseers who will in the near future rush to this charming region in the land of the big red apple. My companions were the same as mentioned in the preceding chapter, a nephew, James Arthur Owen, and an obliging tall young man of 20, who acted as guide and driver. Relieving ourselves of all superfluous burdens just within the cave entrance, we lighted candles and sat down to wait for our eyes to adjust themselves to the changed condition, from brilliant sunlight to absolute darkness, broken only by the feeble strength of 3 candles. It was noticeable that in the moist atmosphere of the Missouri caves, 3 candles were not more than equal to 1 in the dry caves of South Dakota. Very soon we were able to continue the inspection of our surroundings, and the large passage we were in would more properly be called a long chamber, of irregular width, but averaging about 30 feet. This ends abruptly, nearly 500 feet from the entrance, but a small passage scarcely more than 6 feet high runs off at right angles, and into this we turn. It is not quite so nearly dry as the outer chamber, and at a distance of less than 100 feet, we suddenly come to the end of dry land at an elbow of the silently flowing river, whose channel we had almost stepped into. The ceiling dipped so we were not able to stand straight, and the guide said he had never gone farther. But to his surprise, here was a light boat which I am ready to admit he displayed no eagerness to appropriate to his own use, and swimming about it close to shore were numerous small eyeless fish, pure white and perfectly fearless, the first I had ever seen, and little beauties. By burning magnesium ribbon, we saw that the passage before us was a low arch, and occupied from wall to wall by water, the direction of the flow being into another of somewhat greater size, at right angles to that by which we had come, and at the mouth of this lay the boat. The distance we could see in either direction was of tantalizing shortness, and the boat was provided with no means of guidance or control, save an abundance of slender twine which secured it to a log of drift from the outside. So I decided to leave my companions in charge of the main coil of twine, while I went on an excursion alone there being not much evident cause for apprehension, as no living cow could ever have made the trip to this favored spot. Although the water looked perfectly placid, the boat drifted with surprising speed, so that the two scared faces peering after me were soon lost sight of. The channel was nowhere more than 6 feet wide. Consequently, as the boat inclined to drive against either wall, I was able with care to keep it off the rocks with my hands, and in the same way guide it around the sharp turns in safety. After several of these turns, there appeared the mouth of a passage so much smaller that the roof was only 12 inches above the sides of the boat, and I could touch both walls at the same time. By running the boat across this, it was held in place by the current, and I could sit at ease and enjoy the position, which even the least imaginative person can readily conceive to have been a novel one. The small eyeless fish had been noticeable in the water everywhere, but now came swimming about the boat in an astonishing multitude, and as unconscious of any possible danger as bees in a flower garden. Having no eyes, they were naturally undisturbed by the light, so the candle could be held close to the water for a satisfactory examination of the happy creatures. They bore a striking resemblance to minnows, although a few were larger, and it is claimed that 4 or 5 inches are sizes not unusual, but they happened not to be on exhibition. Even dipping a hand into the water in their midst occasioned no alarm, and they might have been caught by dozens. The guide now loudly called that he had fears of the twine being cut on the sharp edges of rock, and that cutting off all possibility of the boat's return, which being sufficiently reasonable, explorations were indefinitely suspended, and a landing soon made. The camera and flashlight were then prepared for taking a view, and a point of light being needed to work by, the nephew was asked to sit in the boat with his candle, to which he readily consented, but judging from the developed picture, it may be doubted if his pleasure at the time was extremely keen. On leaving the cave, the guide said it would not be necessary to return to the upper end of the gulf in order to reach the surface, as the ascent could be made in another place, and leading the way to the left of the entrance, he started up the nearly perpendicular wall, more than 200 feet high, by a sort of blind trail that would have caused a mountain sheep to sigh for wings, but it was very beautiful. We walked over to the wagon road on the high ridge above the middle of the bridge, and going down the forest-clad slopes to the perpendicular wall, in which is the smaller of the great arches, admired from this fair point of view the marvelous grandeur of one of the greatest natural wonders. The weather being perfect after a rain the day before, there was no need of haste to get indoors, so we lingered in the afternoon and then drove to the Mammoth Spring in Arkansas, a short distance south of the Missouri state line, where the Cave River, just visited, comes to the surface in a bounding spring of great force, the distance being little less than 9 miles. The basin filled by the spring might be called a lake, as its size of 200 by 300 feet gives it that appearance, and the color is a remarkable deep blue. The volume of water is so nearly uniform that the height seldom varies more than 2 or 3 inches, but 3 years ago a storm of unusual violence carried out most of the native fish, and in restocking from government supplies, The clear, cold water suggested an experiment with mountain trout, which are found to be doing well. Where Mammoth Spring flows out, its power is utilized by a flour mill on one bank and a cotton mill on the other, and the water flowing on forms Spring River, well known for the charm of its beautiful scenery. This spring is described by Dr. David Dale Owen in his first report of a geological reconnaissance of the northern counties of Arkansas, 1857 and 1858, pages 60 to 61. Stay tuned for the next segment from Cave Regions of the Ozarks and Black Hills by Luella Agnes Owen. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Vanzaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find many interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.